Thank you, everybody. So for this 45-minute session, we're going to talk more about CWE mappings. And I'm very glad to have both a tool vendor representative and a software vendor representative here. So let's start off with some very brief introductions. So Amy Gale from Grammatech, why don't you give us a quick introduction of you and your role at Grammatech.
So hi, I'm Amy. I'm the senior technical writer at Grammatech, which involves having a lot of fingers and a lot of pies, including, for the sake of this discussion, being one of the people that's responsible for maintaining CWE mappings for the Code Sonar tool, and taking perhaps an advocacy position for CWE within Code Sonar. You can see by my bio that I don't really have one because I'm not used to having an external facing role, but it is largely concerned with making sure that lots of things are explained in good ways.
Thank you, Amy. And Nick?
Yes, I'm with Red Hat. I'm a product security engineer. I focus on OpenStack, which is basically a tool to manage lots and lots of virtual machines. To date myself, I've been getting paid to do security stuff for about as long as, or half of my time has been in quarantine that I've been doing security work. So that's a little about me.
Okay, great, thank you. So now let's talk a teeny bit more about and share with the audience a little bit about how each of you and your organizations use CWE. So Amy, let's start with you. And I have both of your image slides in here, so I will follow your directions and switch the images as you need.
Okay. So Grammatech's been involved with CWE for a while, and our primary, well, dominant at least, use of CWE is in one of our commercial tools, which is a bug finding tool called Code Sonar. So I had a very brief image clip of a bit of Code Sonar just to give you a tiny taste. The other one. So it takes source code or binary code in one of a number of languages, runs a number of checks, reports a number of what we call issues, because not all of them are even problems necessarily. They are violations of some coding standard, and you're very naughty and your boss will yell at you, but it's not actually a bug in any real sense. Will highlight points along the path to the bug if it's path related, try and explain why it thinks what's going on, and then make some announcement at a point that there is a problem of a specific kind, which we refer to as a bug class. I think the term checker is also widely used. In this case, the class is uninitialized variable, and those classes are associated with what we call categories. And one of the taxonomies of category that we do that with, and probably the most important one, is CWE. And so there are many hundreds of these classes. Each of them has underlyingly some set of mapped categories. And if you were using Code Sonar Live, you could well, you could scroll to the top of this report and it would tell you those things, but you could also click on that question mark and it would take you to a page that looks something like the next slide, or the previous slide as it turned out, and tell you what's going on there. And this page illustrates several of the kinds of pitfalls that you can come into when you're trying to do a mapping. So I don't know, Steve, if you want me to start talking about that now or leave that for later.
Yeah, let's leave that for later.
Okay.
Bring up.
And then our other interactions with CWE come through our various research projects. So they will often have a government research project with a brief that some specified set of CWE weaknesses must be addressed by the prototype. And I'm not necessarily directly involved with that. That doesn't come through our mapping activities as such, although people may come to me and say, oh, you know about CWE. So while we have various places in the company that interact with CWE, the dominant one at the moment is CodeSonar.
Right. Thank you. And then Nick, let's hear a little bit about Red Hat and how CWE is used within Red Hat.
Absolutely. So as a software vendor, we produce a bunch of software. Some of that comes with CVEs, which are later discovered, and many of them are fixed. And during my team, product securities analysis, we assign a CWE to that specific instance. And the majority of how we use that data now is in our annual risk report that says we had this many vulnerabilities this year, and compared to the previous year, we've gone up 20% or whatever. And the CWE is a way to just absorb, partition, understand kind of the large amount of data that is produced there. So yeah, right now, you can think of CWE as kind of a bulk way to market the amount of security effort that goes into producing our software. But we're hoping to use it in many other ways in the future as well.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So let's get into our first question, which was touched on a little bit earlier today, which is the notion of CWE coverage. There was the mention of CWE gaps, where maybe there are weaknesses being found and identified for which there isn't really a very clear CWE mapping. And hopefully with the CWE pillar model, everything can at least map to this really, highest top level weakness that is at the pillar level of abstraction. Sometimes it might be more suitable, or the best match might be an arbitrary category. And categories within CWE, we're trying to get a little bit more direct about really discouraging users from mapping things to categories, because categories are not weaknesses per se. They are other kinds of collections of things that happen to be useful for navigation and maybe useful for how users think about things, but they're not really organized like weaknesses in an ISA kind of style hierarchy. So to open this up, and Nick, I'll start with you. How often do you run into cases where you really don't have an appropriate mapping to a CWE for a particular issue, and how do you go and try and address that?
I don't know that we specifically capture data about those cases. It happens. Occasionally an analyst will come to us and say, which of these two should I pick? We are currently using the 1003 view, which is pretty high level. In the past, we'd had a more hand-picked coverage that was broader and more detailed. So for now, we don't have a great way to say to give that feedback to MITRE and discuss with the industry. Hey, there's a specific case that we're running into often that we don't feel our needs are being met.
Okay, thank you. We'll get a little bit deeper into views later during this session, but for those who might be unfamiliar, View 1003 identifies a subset of CWEs, about 120, which are the ones that are most commonly found within publicly reported vulnerabilities. And part of the intention of the design of View 1003 is for usability, so that people don't have to deal with all 900 plus weaknesses that are identified in CWE. But we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a later question. So Amy, over to you. How often do you run into these kinds of cases where CWE is not really delivering on its intended promise of enabling you to really describe a weakness and link to it appropriately?
We do run into cases from time to time where no CWE entry at all is appropriate, but that's not a significant problem for us. All that means is that that warning class doesn't have a CWE mapping, and it's a little sad, and it makes our tables look a little sparser than we'd really like, but you know, we're still detecting it. We just can't cite a CWE ID to go with it. It is a little more common that we can only characterize something in terms of a category. We are trying to shift all of our mappings so that categories are not part of the direct mapping, and they only fall out as you chase ancestors up the inheritance hierarchy. And there's also cases where the only applicable ID is something that's very broad. For example, we have many, many mappings to 710, the coding
that
standard.
feels like a pillar.
Coding standard. And
yes.
So, you know, that's not necessarily ideal, but it's also not harmful as such.
I wonder if maybe this is an appropriate time to go back to your example with one of your images, talking a little bit about these.
Okay, yes, all right.
Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay.
So one thing that happens is that it is very infrequent that a CWE weakness lines up exactly with a code sonar warning class. It does happen, but it is more common that a weakness, as described by CWE, is a strict subset or a strict superset of what we're detecting and what we're claiming to detect, or that it is, you know, in a set theoretic sense, incomparable, that there's a lot of overlap, but there's a bit left out in each direction. And so this is one of the things, probably the most amusing, well, if you've got a very generous sense of humor, cases. So we have a warning class that detects a redundant condition, so a condition that is always either always true or always false. And there are CWEs for both of those. So we say underlyingly that both of those are subsets of this class. But if we're presenting it to users in as sparse a way as possible, because extra information tends to just upset people, and you say, well, this is both always false and always true. Sorry, guys. And also irrelevant code. And they're also telling on myself, there's a stray mapping to a category that will be going away. Sorry about that. As of the next release after the next one, if I have anything to say about it. So that's the kind of thing that happens. And so we end up, rather than saying this class is this CWE, this class is related to this CWE in this manner. And we have, I want to say, about a dozen relationships to draw on. I just added a new pile a couple of months ago. Sorry.
I think there's one or two other things that are interesting about this. When I saw this example, you know, ahead of time, I was thinking about, well, you also have here a mapping to the CERT C coding standard, specifically about dead code. And we do have a CWE for dead code. So you could imagine somebody might map something to a CWE for dead code. But then I was also looking a little bit deeper into the relationships, and we have irrelevant code as a parent of dead code. And then expression is always false and expression is always true for some reason are both under dead code, except I don't know about that. So we have our own inaccuracies our own areas of uncertainty within CWE itself.
Yeah, and I think there's also some degree of inconsistency between, or well, not necessarily between authorities, but across the entire usership base on what dead code really is. And I think in this case, the you know, is the body's not necessarily dead, just the conditional. It's all a bit, you know, depending on where. If it's always false, the body's dead. If it's always true, it's only the conditional line that's dead. And so these sorts of subtleties can make life at the mapping interface very difficult, I think. The other thing that I think I told you in email that I haven't brought up is that what we do is actually generate the information in this table from the same information that's used by the implementation that's reporting the bugs. And I think that I would definitely recommend that as a practice to anyone in this line. That's an opportunity to get out of sync that you can avoid.
All right, thank you. And I'd just like to quickly notice a comment that I think it was Alex Toole who had just said that, you know, that unreachable code is different than dead code. And I can see a lot of people having thoughts about that. Will never execute.
So I would say that, I mean, whether deliberately or not, you know, if you're taking the definition that I was thinking of, which is that you can delete it without changing the program, then that's where my argument about being allowed to delete the body if it's always false comes from.
And I think this is a challenge that we run into in a lot of different parts of CWE, maybe throughout all of it, which is that different people might look at the same different piece of code and have different ways of describing it or thinking about it. And maybe we run into this a little bit more in CWE because we have this disparate set of people sharing and mapping to CWEs in slightly different ways. So thank you for that. And we'll just move on to the next question. Well, actually, very quickly, in terms of CWE coverage, one more thing. In the past few years, we've expanded CWE to cover more quality-oriented problems related to maintainability, portability, and so on. And then also, just within the last year and a half or so, we've also brought in hardware. Have these expansions into these other areas affected your own usage of CWE or customer perceptions, and how do you manage that? So Amy, let's stick with you for just a moment. So
hardware isn't affecting our usage at all. Quality has the potential to affect our usage because, as I skipped very quickly over earlier, there are a lot of things that you can detect statically, and we do detect statically, that really are just quality issues, not bugs as such. And the more accurately we can characterize those, the better.
Okay, and Nick, any comments on this?
Absolutely, the hardware was a big deal for us. If a silicon vendor or CPU vendor discovers a serious vulnerability, it frequently comes to the operating system vendor to respond to it. We may not be able to do everything, but typically we have to deploy their firmware updates at the very minimum, if not additional mitigations. So when the hardware category first came out, our team jumped on that quite quickly, added that to our coverage, and then I actually went and manually recategorized some of our historic ones and updated those. So that was significant for us.
Interesting, thank you. So let's move into some discussion about CWE Views. And for the audience, I'm just going to give a quick presentation on this. We have probably about, I don't know, 15 or 20 different views within CWE, most of which identify subsets of individual weaknesses or other kinds of entries, and sometimes organized in a hierarchical fashion. Some of the three main views that we pay a lot of attention to on the MITRE side. First is View 1000, which is the research view. This one by design is intended to cover every single weakness that's within CWE. So it has 100% coverage of all weaknesses with no categories whatsoever. And it really is intended to be some kind of a hierarchy, although many individual entries can have multiple parents. This has gone through a number of different changes over the 15 plus years, but it still looks a little sort of messy and disorganized as it had from the beginning. There are certain areas that are more well fleshed out into lower levels of detail. Think about areas like buffer overflows or injection, which are fairly concrete and fairly well studied. But then we get into other messier areas such as access control, where there hasn't been as extensive deep research from a classification perspective that makes it more difficult to inform how we think about things and how we represent them. And so this is very useful from a research perspective to really be able to identify where some gaps are or where there may be some areas of confusion. And this graph here, all of these are based on CWE 4.3. View 699 is the other classic, which is a little bit more developer friendly. And it covers about half of the CWE weaknesses out there, 418 of them, across a variety of categories, which are going to be more understandable and relevant to developers, things such as issues related to file processing and so on. As you can see, it's a much shallower hierarchy with a fixed depth of 2. 5 years ago or older, the developer view looked a little bit more like the research view, but recently we put in more systematic approaches to really try and narrow that down. And the former CWE lead, Drew Butner, was really critical to this. And, but we're only covering half of the weaknesses. Then finally, as we had discussed briefly, and I don't know, can people see the graph on the side or am I obscuring it?
No, we can see it.
You can see it, okay, great. So this is the only view that could fit on the slide entirely and still show some of the different colors for the different levels of abstraction. But this is View 1003, which is used by NVD and by others as a way to get at least the most commonly encountered weaknesses, while still keeping the hierarchy down to a shallow depth, but avoiding categories entirely and depending more on classes and bases. So as you can see here, there really is a different approach for each of these views, especially in terms of the weaknesses that they select upon. So let's have a little bit of discussion on that. So for 1003 and 699 and some others, these really do cover only a subset of weaknesses, but they're really intended for usability for some kinds of users so that they don't have to deal with all 900 plus weaknesses that we have out there. What are some of the strengths and limitations of this approach here? So Nick, let's start with you. You said that you use View 1003. What was it that, what was the feature of View 1003 that helped encourage you to use that instead of more comprehensive weaknesses earlier on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that change was not so much by choice. My long-term goal for our CWE usage is to have as broad and as deep a data collection as possible. And I don't know, 6 months or so ago, NVD/NIST started auditing the CVE the CNAs, anyone that produces or assigns a CVE, and we're one of those groups. So we started getting audited on that, and it feels a little bit like a whack-a-mole. If you're using a CWE that's outside of the 1003 view, you kind of get, you know, a hammer tapped on your thumb. So you're very encouraged to use that view, and there's little. I'd love to speak with the right people at NIST to figure out where we should go to not get penalized for using ones outside of that. That's something to be figured out.
Amy, any insights on your side?
I think not really. We don't use views ourselves. To the extent that any information about customers reaches me, I don't think they're necessarily using them either. I think it is much more common for them to be working off a shopping list of key CWEs that they've obtained somehow, often from their own customers. So there's many layers of customers in here. So I'm not sure that this is, you know, if these views are being used at all, it's several removes from us.
And Steve, I think Chris Turner might have something to share.
Yep. Yes, so Chris Turner, who is with NIST and involved in NVD, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So y'all can hear me, right? Just want to make sure before we get going.
Yep, I can hear you.
So, I mean, just as a sidebar, I'd be happy to talk to you, Nick, going forward about the auditing. It is a misnomer about the penalization that you're talking about. It's not really designed to be like that, but the intention behind that whole program is to encourage folks who are new to CWE to start with the 1003 and then kind of move and expand beyond that. We are well aware that there's a great deal of valuable selections within the entire CWE corpus that could be used, and we simply limit ourselves to the 1003 view as a way of, frankly, not needing to know in depth the entire CWE corpus, as most folks who participate in CWE assignment are aware. It's a tough thing to digest, especially on the scale that needs to be done with the volume of CVEs being published on a daily basis. One of the things I was really interested in, though, is it seems like you know, from our perspective, we're kind of doing this post analysis based off of information that is, you know, say publicly available for any given vulnerability. But it seems like some of the folks, the panelists for this section here, are coming from a completely different angle, and perhaps a lot of the folks on this call come from a completely different angle, where you're able to look at the code and kind of make your determinations from like the origin point, as opposed to, you know, the published information. And I was curious if there's insights that come from maybe seeing both of those perspectives, of doing the CWE mapping from both of those perspectives.
Can I ask a question here? Chris, this is one of the things that we've been trying to do is make sure we do a better mapping between CWE and CVEs, the ones that have been issued. And what you're saying is that NIST is now artificially skewing the outcome of that. And that's going to make our job even more complicated in trying to determine the relevant CWEs. So I'd really like to get your feedback on that, because that's going against what we're trying to do.
I'm sorry, could you repeat how you think it's skewing the information?
It's skewing if they only report those that are in view 1003. That means any relevant CWEs that are outside of that, they're not going to report them because they're being penalized, as Nick referred to it as. And that complicates our job of trying to understand which weaknesses really are the most relevant. And, you know, trying to develop, and by the way, that's also linked with the hardware side, and I realize it's a separate conversation here, but Right.
So I just want to save a lot of this, because a lot of this is conversation related to the CV map program and not necessarily the CWE compatibility program. or the summit that's going on. For any of these conversations, I'd be absolutely happy to take it offline, just because I don't want to take up all of the time on the topic. But I can tell you with confidence that the way the program is put into place and the way that folks can interact and participate with it is designed not to negatively affect things in the way you are voicing your concerns or the way Nick is voicing his concerns.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is
Thank you.
Bob. Just if I can reiterate what I think Chris is saying is his staff, when they do the assignment, uses the view so that they don't have to know everything. But any researcher that knows the right CWE should use it with full confidence and, you know, to get as accurate a assignment as possible.
One quick thing to note, and then I'll call on Alex Hool, and then we'll move on to a couple of other discussion points, is that for the CWE Top 25, which is going to be in the next session, we wrestled with this ourselves. On the MITRE side, we made sure to make the most precise mapping available, and then we normalized that data when providing feedback to NVD to follow the View 1003 for CVE. So we still have the original precise mappings, but there is a little bit of lossage once it shows up in the public records. That said, as Chris Turner has discussed, they are making a number of changes that allow for additional things. So let's move on to Alex, and then.
But it sounds like it pretty well guarantees the top 25 is going to only be limited to the 1003 view.
We can bring that up in the top 25 session. Alex, thank you for waiting so patiently.
No problem, Steve. Thank you. So one of the things that is coming up here, and I thank the panelists for their insights from the customer perspective as well. One of the challenges with CVEs is some vendors will view it as a disadvantage to be too precise when doing a CVE disclosure, because the viewpoint is that that will enable attackers to attack their systems that are not patched sooner. Now, one argument could be made that that would make it easier for people running automated tools to launch attacks quickly and easily. But the other thing is if a CVE is published at a high level CWE and the patch is made public, there are people out there that reverse patches. So really you're just creating a window of how long it takes somebody to figure out what the real weakness was. And it's sort of security through obscurity. So one of the challenges I think we have is we want to be as precise with CWEs, but also factor in vendor concerns around how much is disclosed.
Thank you, Alex. One final point on this, and this is a good demonstration of how CWE usage, there are multiple use cases. There are multiple kinds of users. The people who need to patch vulnerabilities probably don't care that much about which CWE a vulnerability is attached to for a particular CVE. It's important for trend analysis, but on the other hand, for tool vendors at the very least, as I think we've learned from Amy, you want to be as precise as possible because that's part of the advice that you're giving to developers for their own code, for them to then address their code. So let's move on a little bit, and I want to talk briefly, just briefly about CWE mapping guidance, which is a document that many of you may have heard that we've been working on within MITRE. And this is really based on community feedback that we've gotten over the years, where CWE users really do encounter problems when they're trying to find the correct CWE entry to map to. Especially if they're new, they might not necessarily know where to start. And so we have developed a document that kind of covers different methods that are currently available to help people with doing their mappings. And that's something that we're going to be putting a first public release out after CWE 4.4 next week. And our initial use case really is primarily on mapping publicly disclosed vulnerabilities, but we are looking for feedback from a variety of participants. I believe that this will be talked about a little bit more in a later session, but I want to use this as a framing question for Nick and for Amy in terms of training guidance. So Let's start with you, Nick. Do you find that you're needing to train new people about CWE? If so, what kind of areas do they really need any kind of extra help? And how skilled in vulnerability analysis do they really need to be to perform correct mappings?
So in our department, all the people that are working on these CVEs are security analysts by title or security engineer. So they know a decent amount about software. They know a decent amount about security. They've heard of a buffer overflow before. So we don't have to give them any specific CWE training. We have a little bit of automation when a CVE is first being created. There's a bit of information we capture, and we have a little bit of tooling that searches through that information and tries to guess at what CWE could possibly be appropriate. And then before things are actually published, an analyst, a real human, verifies that information.
Thank you. Amy, any insights here?
This is something that is just starting to come up because we've got a new product coming online that's going to have some CWE presence. And what I found is that that people don't seem to need a lot of explicit training about CWE, that they find out they're going to be using it, they take themselves off to the website and they learn what they need to know pretty much. And a couple of people I've given additional pointers like, oh, do you understand that it's versioned? You know, you can go off and look at the version history, but beyond that sort of level of information, I think this worker population I'm working with, which are trained computer scientists, just find it makes sense, and you know that yeah, there's not a lot needed at our end.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Chris, can I barge in here?
I like the other question too.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, continue. Sorry.
I mean, but we haven't asked it yet, right?
And please raise your hand instead of barging in. I'll call people in order of raising their hands. Go ahead, Amy.
Sorry, but you hadn't actually asked the next question, right?
Yeah, I sort of combined it as well, but let's go ahead. Yeah, say what you mean.
So I think that is the hard side of it, that you need to understand the problem you're discussing. That is usually the part that's harder than figuring out what CWE goes with it. With the two caveats, one being that you're often trying to characterize a number of imperfect relationships with multiple CWE weaknesses. And the other being that from time to time, it is a bit more difficult than other times to figure out what a given CWE weakness description is actually describing. And I think that would be a really valuable place for these formal characterizations, that provided an organization can maintain a population of staff that's literate in the formalisms, you can be very sure that you're mapping to what you think you're mapping to.
Thank you. Nick, anything else to add, or should we go to questions from the audience?
Let's keep moving.
All right, Alex. Alex, we'll go ahead with your question or comment.
Thank you. So one thing that I'd just like to add is probably a question to Amy first and Nick Wynn too. It's not so much as how easy is it to understand a CWE, in my mind, Steve, is if you've got somebody new coming into it, having the breadth of knowledge of being able to choose the correct CWE out of a sea of 1,000.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, so in my experience, there is a certain class of users that do need some additional training. And those are the ones that are given a set of CWEs and told, purchase a tool that covers these CWEs, and they don't understand that CWEs are, have this hierarchy, and that and so they don't know how to do that mapping themselves very well. Now, in our case, what we do is we have what we call a close mapping and a broad mapping. and Amy can correct me if I get any of this wrong, but the broad mapping is generous. The close mapping is much more conservative. And one of the reasons we did the broad mapping was to address that use case where somebody would look at our tool and say, oh, it doesn't cover CWE such and such, even though we covered a parent of it, and then just write us off as being not suitable for their use.
Yeah, it's certainly the case that I was taking people to mean colleagues, and it can also mean customers.
All right, great. We'll move on to the next question. Just a quick note that Chris Ang is in general agreement, I think, with Alex, I believe it was. So we're down to a couple minutes left, and really we can end on this. Does CWE's hierarchical organizations, we have 3 different hierarchies, or probably 10, because every individual view that's a hierarchical is effectively its own hierarchy. Does CWE's hierarchical organization help or hurt? How does this contribute to either mapping errors or service level inconsistencies, especially if you're doing comparisons across different code analysis tools or across, say, different development teams or different vendors? So let's start with you, Nick, and we'll follow up with Amy.
Don't have much to add. We basically ignore them.
Okay, Amy?
We very much don't ignore them, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat, and has been most of the day, about how there's this essentially unavoidable inconsistency between how different people will map the same problem at a slightly different place within this parent-child relationship based on their appreciation of what they're trying to express. You know, if there's a weakness and it has 6 children and you could detect 5 of them, do you say you detect the parent or the 5 children but not the 6th? It's not even clear that there's really a right answer. So, you know, we take, by and large, we take the position that we'll make the precise mapping. And then, as Paul alluded, we have something called the broad mapping, where we do, among other things, chase the hierarchy up and stick all of ancestors into this broad mapping. And so an accurate hierarchical organization is key to that, capturing what we needed to capture to customers who, like I said, are often working off a shopping list that they may not have even been able to choose.
Thank you. And with that, we've used up our session time. We've used it very effectively, I believe. Thanks for the questions. And Nick and Amy, appreciate you for taking the time to talk with everyone about this. And let's hand it off back to Kevin or Alex for the next session.